Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel Steve the Tour Guide. And I'm Steve the Tour Guide. And we're going to begin Ezra chapter 4 this morning, which I'll probably divide into a couple of episodes because there's a lot to say. But let's pick it up at the outset here. We're going to talk about a people who later in the New Testament are referred to as the Samaritans. And the name of this episode is The Good Samaritans. Really? Are these people really good? Well, we're going to go back to the origins of the subject. So let's pick it up. Ezra chapter 4. Now, these people become very important, and they were sort of inferred, or they were literally referred to, but for briefly, in the last chapter, is local opposition to the Jews. Remember, now we can call these people Jews because these returnees from the exile, the Babylonian exile, are comprised mostly of the tribe of Judah, with a smattering of some Benjaminites in their midst. One of those Benjaminites must become at some point the forefather of the Apostle Paul, because it's in the New Testament that we hear for the last time somebody referring to themselves by a particular tribe of Israel rather than just as a Jew. Okay, when Paul says that he is a Benjaminite. So we're going to begin here in Ezra chapter 4 and talk about this people who became the local opposition to the Jews as they are restored to the land, rebuild the altar, which we saw in the last chapter, and try to interfere with the building of the temple itself, okay, which will take up the next couple chapters. So beginning here with verse 1. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to Yahweh, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel, the heads of the fathers' houses, and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. And we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Yeshua, and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to Yahweh, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." To examine the origins of these people that would be later known as the Samaritans in the New Testament, it helps to go back to the book of 2 Kings chapter 17, beginning with verse 24, which tells the story of the king of Assyria settling these people in the land in lieu of the Israelites, which the Assyrians had just carried captive from the land eastward to Assyria. Okay, now the reason why the Assyrian king plants these people in the land to replace the Israelites is so that the land does not just lay there abandoned. Okay, he wants the land to be sown, to be farmed, for taxes to be paid, and for the land to be productive, because the productive land leads to income accrued to the king's own treasury. Okay, so let's read about this, and it takes up here a couple paragraphs of chapter 17 of 2 Kings. Here we go. "And the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuthah, Ava, Hamath, Shepharim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria," hence the term later, the Samaritans, okay, "and lived in its cities. And at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear Yahweh. Therefore Yahweh sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, 'The nations that you've carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land.'" Okay, now just know that in the ancient world, the belief in the ancient Middle East, at least, was that each nation's God, the power of that God, is limited to the frontiers of that country. So the gods of Egypt are sovereign over the dominion of Egypt, and the power of those gods end at the borders of Egypt. Likewise, the God of Israel, according to that same worldview, his power as the God of Israel is limited to the dominion of the land of Israel. His power ends at the frontiers of the land of Israel, and such is believed also by the Assyrians related to their gods. Okay, so here he's sown in the land of Israel, people from elsewhere, and they have come to the land, and they're ignorant. And here's them expressing, we don't know how to worship the local deity here. And because we're not worshiping the local deity as he requires, we're being torn asunder by lions, okay, in the fields and in the cities. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you have carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are killing them because they do not know the law of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there, and let him go to dwell there, and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and lived in Beit El, and taught them how they should fear Yahweh. Well, now the problem is compounded even more, because this priest from among the exiles of Israel, he himself is not representing a pure religion or a pure service unto Yahweh. For we read in the books of Judges and later in Kings and Chronicles that the nation of Israel divided upon the death of Solomon when his son Rehoboam ascended to the throne. If you recall, he failed to win over the whole of the populace. They split, therefore, into two Jewish kingdoms. The one to the north would retain the name Israel, and it was comprised of 10 tribes of Israel. The one to the south was called Judah and was ruled by each successive scion of the house of David. And if you recall, the first king of Israel, that is the Israel after Solomon, his name is Jeroboam. And Jeroboam committed one of the worst sins in Jewish history, for he set up a counterfeit sacrificial system to Yahweh. The Bible says that he became jealous of the notion that his people or subjects would make pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the 3 holidays of Passover, weeks, and tabernacles, where when they would see a descendant of David on the throne in Jerusalem, their hearts would long for the glory days of the united kingdom of Israel under the house of David. And therefore Jeroboam sets up a competing sacrificial system, with an altar being built at Tel Dan, which many of you who have been on tours to Israel have seen. Okay, and many of you, all of you have been with me on tour, have seen it. At Tel Dan, okay, the altar of Jeroboam there, as well as one on the southern frontier of that kingdom of Jeroboam in Beth El, which was mentioned just now. Okay, so an altar of Jeroboam at Tel Dan, an altar at Jeroboam at Bethel, and on both those altars, it is said in the Bible that Jeroboam placed golden bulls and said, "Here, O Israel, are the gods that led you out of Egypt," and thus starts the beginning of a long succession of generations of fornication, spiritual fornication, okay, because that's the language used in Hebrew related to this whole affair. The Israelites commit spiritual fornication against Yahweh by worshiping a combination of Yahweh and foreign deities like Baal. You refer to Baal probably by the name Baal in American accented English, okay, but Baal in Hebrew, as well as Ashtoreth, okay? In other words, it's not that the Israelites abandoned Yahweh wholesale, but they added to the cult of Yahweh the cults of Baal and Ashtoreth. Now, just keep in mind, in the last teaching or 2 teachings ago, I explained that when I use the word cult, I'm not using it in the way we understand it or use it in today's parlance to refer to these religious cults like David Koresh or Jim Jones, who had his people drink Kool-Aid there in the jungles. Okay, where was it? In Ghana? Uh, when I use the word cult in the field of religious studies, it's referring to that central rite of worship of a religion. The cult of Catholicism is the Eucharist and Mass service. The cult of biblical Judaism was the altar in Jerusalem. The cult of Jeroboam's religion was the sacrificial altars of Dan and Bethel, and the syncretizing of the cult of Yahweh with foreign deities which were worshipped in those two locations. And this causes the Israelites to fornicate to the point where Yahweh vomits them out of his mouth. And it leads to the expulsion of the 10 tribes of that northern kingdom by the Assyrian Empire beginning in the year 722 BC. Now, what's the problem here? The Assyrians have planted their people in lieu of the Israelites in that territory of northern Israel, and they've asked for a priest to be brought from the exiled Israelites to teach them how to worship the God of the land. But he himself is misguided because he himself is already a priest whose forefathers for the previous several generations, starting with Jeroboam, have not worshiped Yahweh in truth either. Hey, it's like the blind being led by the blind. Okay, so that compounds the problem here. He's not going to instruct them back to a pure religion, okay, of Yahwehism. I won't refer to it as Judaism. I'll refer to it as Yahwehism, okay, because Judaism, as we know it today, and I don't want to turn this into a big digression here, we'll talk about this elsewhere, is called Rabbinical Judaism. It is a later stage of the Jewish people's religion. I'll refer to what's going on in biblical times. The cult of Yahweh is Yahwehism. That's Steve, the tour guide's name for, let's say, pure biblical Judaism of the Old Testament, okay? Picking it up again here in 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 29. But every nation, okay, in other words, all those various peoples that the Assyrian king planted into the land of Israel, but every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities in which they lived. The men of Babylon made Sukkot Benot. The men of Cuth made Nirgal. The men of Hamath made Ashima. And the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak. And the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire of Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of the Sepharvaim. They also feared Yahweh and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests. Okay, so here again, you see that inferred that syncretism, Yahweh plus, okay, Yahweh plus the gods of all these other peoples, a pantheon of gods, which, to be courteous to the local god, Yahweh included him, okay, but it wasn't worship focused on him exclusively, okay? Uh, and they appointed all sorts of people as priests, okay? So they're not keeping the priesthood that God determined in the law of Moses to be set aside out of the Levites, out of the descendants of Aaron. Okay? And it wasn't just the descendants of Aaron, it was the descendants of one of Aaron's sons. Okay, it gets very particular in the law of Moses who's to preside in the Lord's temple. Okay, and again, this was a sin that the Israelites were themselves committing on the eve of their being exiled from the land. The locals who have now been planted there by the Assyrians are doing likewise. They're appointing priests from among themselves, from all sorts of people, as priests of the high places, who sacrifice for them in the shrines of the high places. So they feared Yahweh, but also served their own gods after the manner of the nations from among whom they've been carried away. And thus, friends, is the origin story of the Samaritans, or the people to be known later as the Samaritans in the New Testament. Now, of course, I called this episode Good Samaritans, really? Okay, now we all know the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I may conclude the teaching on Ezra chapter 4 with that foray into the New Testament parable of the Good Samaritan, okay? But their origins are far from being good, okay? These were pagans that were sown by the king of Assyria into the land of Israel. They brought with them their foreign deities, and even though they have a priest of Israel as their tutor, well, he himself is blind. Okay, he himself is the product or descendant of a, for lack of a better word, a perverted or bastardized priesthood. Okay, a far from pure priesthood of the Israelites. Okay, which God had ordained in the law of Moses. So it's the blind leading the blind, and therefore a spiritual perversion that continues in the form of these Samaritans as a continuation of what preceded in the form of a perverted religion, or a religion that was perverted by the Israelites, beginning with King Jeroboam. And by the way, Jeroboam became the standard by which all kings who were declared to be wicked by God were measured. Okay, the Bible would say of each king of the Jews, such and such did like his father David. Okay, in other words, pleasing to the Lord their God, as did their father David. Now, of whom is that said? Well, people like Hezekiah and Josiah. Okay, but most of the other kings, you see them measured or compared to Jeroboam. Okay, where it says, and such did like King Jeroboam, leading the Israelites astray into fornication. Okay, and when the Bible uses the word fornication here, it's not referring to the fornication in sensual means, but spiritually. Okay, a form of spiritual fornication, which caused the Israelites to be vomited out of the land. Now, going back to Ezra's generation has returned to the land as a, for lack of a better word, a purified or corrected Jewish people. For all the sins that we read of in the Hebrew Bible leading up to the exile of both the Israelites to Assyria and the Jews to Babylon, the paganism, the idolatry from this point on and henceforth, from Ezra's generation all the way to the end of the Bible, in other words, including the New Testament, you never again hear of this sin being associated with the Jewish people, the sin of idolatry, okay, the making of idols. Doesn't mean that the hearts of the Jewish people became pure, happily ever after, purely wed to God or purely wed to Yahweh, but what it means is at least the religion was purged of idolatry, but with the exception here of these Samaritans. And as we continue the study of Ezra in future episodes, we're going to see how Ezra's generation stands their ground, refuses to mix with these people, not even, not just spiritually. Okay, we're here again, we read that these Samaritans say to Ezra, let us have a hand in building the temple of Yahweh with you. To which Zerubbabel, Yeshua, and Ezra's generation said, you have no part in this project. In other words, you're not pure. You're not part of this Yahwehism. You're not part of this thing that Yahweh is doing, this restoration of a pure religion or a purified religion to the land of Israel. Okay, Yahweh is both restoring his Jewish people to the land, but we can't lose sight of the fact that he's also trying to restore a pure form of worship. And a few chapters from now, we'll even read where Ezra and his generation is faced with a dilemma, because many of these returned Jews have intermarried with these people of the land, or these so-called Samaritans, okay, or at least it's inferred as such. And it goes so far that they even command these people to divorce their wives, and maybe even the offspring that they've had with these wives. Okay, that's how militant Ezra and this generation is in their endeavor to restore and maintain a pure form of worship to Yahweh. So in this episode, we covered the origins of the Samaritans. And in the next teaching, depending on how many parts I divide this study of Ezra chapter 4 in, I'm going to relate it to today's opposition in the land, known as the Palestinians. Do these Samaritans represent a form of proto-Palestinians or Palestinians on the way to becoming so-called Palestinians? What does the book of Ezra and this generation have to teach us about this current restoration of the land of Israel and this current local opposition, which never ceases to make it into the central news of the newspapers and TV news cycles? For is not Israel fighting a war for its very existence today against such local opposition? So, as I said at the outset of this study of Ezra, the book of Ezra has much to teach us in the way that it presages or is an antecedent for the themes that we're seeing today. For history, my friends, repeats itself. Anyway, folks, this is probably my last episode until after Christmas. I want to wish you all a wonderful Merry Christmas filled with fun, filled with great food and great gifts and warmth. And try to remember the reason for the season, which of course transcends gifts and gift giving. The greatest gift for those of you that are Christians, the greatest gift that entered this world 2,000 years ago. Okay, Jesus born not necessarily on December 25th, but definitely came into the world 2,000 years ago to give you, according to the New Testament, the greatest gift of all, which is New Testament salvation. And therefore, as Christmas comes, I wish you not just a Merry Christmas, but to keep before you the real reason for this season. As much as we love Santa Claus and snow and jingle bells, don't forget the reason for this season. This is Steve the Tour Guide signing off. Be vigilant and be blessed. Bye-bye.